Radio 4. It's 10:15, and now an opportunity to find out about the Motorway Manner. It's presented by Ian Morton of the London Evening Standard.
This motorway starts a new era in road travel. It is in keeping with the bold, exciting and scientific age in which we live. It is a powerful weapon to add to our transport system.
The place, Luton. The date, November the 2nd, 1959, at 9:30 in the morning. The speaker, Ernest Marples, Minister of Transport. The occasion, the opening of the London to Birmingham motorway, 72 miles of M1. For Britain, at last, the motorway era had arrived.
I should loathe to live in England now without motorways.
Motorways have revolutionised travel. They have made it so much easier.
Motorways in Britain are now coming of age. What have they done to us? How have they affected our horizons, our economy, our environment, our lives? Perhaps it's time to look at the problems, the fears, the attainments. Above all, the conflict. Because the nature of motorways is conflict.
If you was watching, the other lad nipped in as he come across.
But I saw you travelling at that distance behind him.
I was behind him because it was...
Come on, get out.
Come on. The planning was bold and the construction swift and efficient. Almost 72 miles of road in 19 months is a magnificent achievement.
But was the planning so bold? You see, November 1959 was in fact 35 years after the Lord Montagu of the time put forward in a private member's bill a motorway scheme to link London and Liverpool. And it was 36 years after work started on the world's first motorway, a 13-mile stretch between Milan and Varese in northern Italy. It was also 24 years after the first stretch of German Autobahn was opened between Frankfurt and Darmstadt.
It is a powerful weapon to add to our transport system. But like all powerful instruments, it can be a power for good or evil. It will bring immense benefits if drivers use discipline, common sense, and obey the rules. But disaster and tragedy may descend on those who drive recklessly or selfishly.
There's a driver trapped in a wagon, and just in front of them, there's a wagon and a car on fire.
Motorway. One of those words. Words that conjure up images, not all of them pleasant. Motorway, a word like teenager, hostage, nuclear, a double-edged word. Freedom to drive into the golden sunset with a chill sub-layer of responsibility. Motorway, convenience with boredom, speed with apprehension, confident menace. That could, of course, be considered over-dramatisation. Motorways are the safest roads in Britain.
That's right. There are every year about 3,800 accidents on motorways, but the number of casualties in relation to the distance driven is much lower than on other rural A-class roads.
Barbara Saby, Head of Accident Investigation at the Government's Transport and Road Research Laboratory.
The accident rate or the casualty rate on motorways is only about 1/3 of that on the other rural roads.
So, statistically, a good accident record for motorways. And thank heavens for it. After the M1 came the M2, M4, M3, M5, M6, M10, M27, M50, M62, M61, parts of M25, M11, and sundry bits of old dual carriageway uprated to motorway standards. 1,300 miles in all, and the first section of M1 near London is now being torn up and relaid because it was designed to take 35,000 vehicles a day and the traffic flows have grown to 80,000. In fact, £13 million is being spent on repairs to 5 motorways this year alone. But yes, the accident record is good. Unfortunately, when an accident does occur, it tends to be a severe one. Higher speeds, higher vehicle occupancy, a larger number of vehicles likely to be involved, more impacts per vehicle. In 1/3 of motorway crashes, a vehicle sustains 2 impacts, and in 10% it takes 3 impacts.
It was thick fog and was having to go very, very steady. It was, well, less than 30 miles an hour, which was quite fast enough, really, considering. up the near side lane, and I was following within a couple of lengths distance of another lorry, and he started to slow up. Another lorry went flying past me, then another one too, and I heard a bang, 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 crash. Saw the other one's tail lights in front come on, so I threw all my brakes on, and I stopped just near him, moving over a little to the left. The next thing, there was a very crash behind me, and something shoved my old lorry right through the back of this one in front of me, taking my old leg and everything right through the back of my wagon. So I've lost my leg. Idioticness. Drivers just can't go that little bit steady. They're idiots. They can see what conditions are like, a little bit of ice about, although not a lot, but fog like that, and you don't get that much visibility. Following anybody's lights in front is just not good enough. You should take more precautions. When you get fools there trying to do 50 and 60 miles an hour on the M1 as they do, even in them conditions, well, they want blocking up.
Motorway madness. Motorway madness. Motorway madness could happen to you.
Idioticness. It seems to be as good a word as any. But is it madness in the sense of sheer stupidity, or madness in the sense of being deceived by abnormal conditions?
In normal conditions, the normal competent driver can make and does make a correct estimate of distance and speed. In fog, he may in fact be misled by his own eyes, because his own eyes will give him information which he will interpret wrongly. He will think that a stoplight, which he can see ahead of himself, again, let us say, he assumes it to be 60 yards. In fact, we know that fog makes distances appear double what they really are, and the object seen appears half its true size. This we know. So, the worst of fog is that it deprives you of all your familiar landmarks. You're in a featureless white sea, a sea of cotton wool, if you like. Now, the last thing that you can still see are your cat's eyes. They're absolutely your lifelines, these reflectors. If they were brought closer together, then the driver wouldn't be instinctively tempted to drive too fast in order to keep one cat's eye ahead in his vision. If he lost that one cat's eye, he would lose all sense of direction. He would no longer know which way to steer. So he is tempted to drive too fast. Bring them closer together, and you bring his speed down.
Medical consultant Keith Jollis. In fact, there have been 2 reports which confirm the view that motorway madness stems from deception rather than stupidity. One proves that if you cover a driver's speedometer and tell him to drive at a constant speed, his speed gradually increases as his senses automatically recalibrate. The other showed that a driver would prefer to rely on his own abilities to react to tail lights ahead of him than on the abilities of anyone following him to respond to his tail lights.
I was looking in my rear-view mirror in the outside lane. I was still in first gear, just waiting to see what was going to run in the back of me. And as it happened, it was a large articulated lorry. When he saw me, he started braking very heavily, and his tyres were smoking, the cab bouncing up and down. And in fact, he stopped well about 5 yards behind me, and then by this time cars had run into the traffic in the slow lane alongside me, and I thought I was clear at that point. Then I heard this metallic shrieking sound, and between the rows of traffic in the outside and the inside lanes came a large truck which just clipped the back bumper of my car.
But of course motorway fog is relatively rare. The human element is ever present, of constant concern to the police.
A motorway accident presents a different problem to an accident on an ordinary 2-lane or dual carriageway road. It surprises me at times that the normal, what you'd say, average run-of-the-mill motorist gets on a motorway and becomes a different man very often. His speed increases, his manner of driving is totally different, and he does things on a motorway that he wouldn't dream of doing on a normal road. He'll be travelling at 60 miles an hour in the centre lane, coming up behind another vehicle. He would just automatically move into the offside lane without checking his mirrors. Somebody coming down the offside lane has to brake to avoid him. We have another accident there, and the chap who actually caused it isn't known and doesn't even know anything about the accident. But this happens time and time again.
When we passed the wrecked car, it was sandwiched between 2 trucks, and it still had a body in it.
There's a law car sat there with his blue light flashing. I thought to myself, what's up here, like? Eased up a bit more. The fellow in front of me stopped. I've stopped, out of gear, handbrake on, bang! and this other fella's hit me up the back.
Disaster and tragedy may descend on those who drive recklessly or selfishly. For on this magnificent road, the speed which can easily be reached is so great that senses may be numbed and judgment warped. The margin of error gets smaller as speed gets faster. New motoring techniques must be learned.
I think the 70 mile an hour speed limit is the correct one to impose.
The police, I suppose, have a necessary job to make us all behave the laws. And I suppose it's true to say that a policeman would immediately shoot me down if I suggested that there should be no such thing as a speed limit and instead greater emphasis on driver control and general road behaviour. I have never actually met the semi-criminal element that I guess must exist to justify these speed limits, the people who will seriously travel at more than 70 miles an hour in very dangerous conditions.
By and large, we get very, very few prosecutions for persons exceeding the 70 mile an hour speed limit.
I think the main problems in Britain came about with the introduction of the 70 mile an hour limit, which caused, from a car driver's point of view, a lot of bunching in the outside lane.
I think that the 70 mile an hour speed limit is a very good example of how a low speed limit can be potentially quite disastrous. If you drive up M1 from Newport Pagnell, as I occasionally do, on a Friday night in the summer, the right-hand lane is a steady queue of cars, all travelling far too close to each other, all doing 70, but all thinking that they really want to do 75.
And I'm being chivied by a white Vauxhall with one of those deep spoilers on the front. Speed here is about 75, and everybody seems to be sticking to it.
In fact, I will say that you can find traffic-free conditions in England on any motorway, anywhere, and that's the inside lane of any three-lane motorway.
William Towns, closely concerned with speed as well he might be. He's the designer of the Aston Martin Bulldog, top speed 200 miles an hour. But at any rate, we do know that a change in motorway speed limits isn't on under this government.
I think the public now understand and know what the speed limit is. I think the speed limit is quite reasonable, and I've no plans to change it.
Transport Minister Norman Fowler.
Well, first of all, I think one mustn't assume that because we have a car capable of 200 miles an hour that the owner of it is going to drive everywhere at 200 miles an hour.
And where indeed can he drive at 200 miles an hour?
Well, one likes to think that the Bulldog customer will not only own his own oil fields, but be the sheikh of his own region. He can write his own laws, and if necessary, he can build himself a 15 miles straight. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that Bulldog requires 17 miles of straight to go to 200 miles an hour and brake safely. The ability to do that sort of speed produces stringent requirements on the designer and aerodynamicist. Clearly, those requirements will find their way back even into harmless family saloons. All of the popular family cars are getting the benefit of the fast car research that happened, 10, 15 years ago.
Before there were motorways, it wasn't really possible to drive at high speeds continuously. And as soon as we got them, cars started getting into all sorts of trouble. They broke because the engines wouldn't stand up. They bust their tyres, so the tyres had to be improved. They suffered very often badly from poor stability in crosswinds, so that's had to be sorted out. There has been quite a lot of change. All you have to do is to drive on a motorway now and see how many people are going beyond the speed limit, whereas if you went back to the early days of motorways, people tried to run continuously at those speeds, their cars would fall apart. In fact, they did, even at the speeds they did go at, and you constantly saw cars broken down at the sides of the motorways.
Of course, one of the real problems on the motorway is the disparity in size, weight and speed between vehicles. It's little consolation to motorway users that inferior beings like pedestrians, cyclists and moped riders are banned from their exclusive club. But any motorist can join it, no matter how lacking in confidence or experience. And there's a monumental and horrifying difference in competence and in sheer stored energy between 32 tons of lorry and load travelling at 50 miles an hour through the pouring rain and the small car proceeding timorously on the same bit of carriageway. In fact, the exclusive motorway club consists of several groups, and each thinks the others have less right to be there than they have.
Cars. This is an example. Spaghetti Junction, they call it. It's like Fantasy Island coming over there, you know, in the morning. You're coming down the slow lane, there's one bit of slow in front of you, you overtake him, as a car comes belting down, he comes straight across in front of you, a right handle. Well, I mean, how the hell do you stop 40 ton?
I mean, for an idiot like that, I mean, you touch him and he's screaming, oh, you bad lorry drivers and all this, that and the other. Can't see the faults as they make. Now, I could understand if we'd only got one idiot doing that. But when you've got probably 200 or 300 of them doing it, then it adds to a nightmare like that.
Lorry drivers don't bother. Who's coming behind, who's coming on the front, they don't bother.
The lorry driver just gives indicators and just pull out, and that's it. They don't think about the other traffic. Because if you're driving a car, you're littler than them, you see.
And the main problem seems to be with the average car driver's just general lack of awareness. Having gone onto the motorway, he switches off his advanced thinking or the number of times that he looks in his mirror to see what's happening behind him. Whereas a truck driver has got a lot to do. He's got a 13 or sometimes 16 speed gearbox. He's constantly changing gear, he's constantly checking mirrors for overtaking, coming back in again, whereas the car driver is sat at the speed that he started off on the motorway until he leaves the motorway in the same gear and probably the same position, listening to his favourite radio programme.
I'll tell you what I would like, see, one thing, is coaches on the motorway. I think it should be brought back to our thing, 2 lanes and the 60-mile-an-hour speed limit, because that buzz is just as dangerous going at 70 mile an hour as what a 4-wheeler lorry would be. On the 4-wheeler lorry, he's only got a chance of probably killing himself. A bus full of people, he could kill all the lot.
Lorry drivers, over a number of years, they've been of big assistance to us at the scenes of accidents where they are first on the scene. And very often you'll find that lorry drivers have partially cleared the road for you or removed injured persons from vehicles. You know, I've got nothing but the highest of praise for some of them. Then we get other, what we call cowboy lorry drivers, who have a I shall get through at all costs attitude. And these are the ones who will fly down the near side lane at 60 miles an hour, come up behind a vehicle that's doing 50, and pull straight out without any signal, without looking, causing traffic behind them to brake.
You've got to bear in mind that the police have got a hell of a job to do. I wouldn't like to be a policeman, I'll tell you, not on the motorway. The sights he sees and what he has to put up with, no way would I do it, I'll tell you straight. They've got an hard job to do. I think a lot of them would like to be more helpful than what they actually are, you know, but I think it's all this massive red tape that sort of restricts them. Then you get the promotion-seeking one. He's going to have you done at all costs, no matter what, to further his place, but thank God we've very few of them.
But you're saying with motorway police, they know what they're talking about. When they pull you for something and there's something wrong, you know you've got to get done for it, like, there's no problem.
What it is, I've just seen you travelling behind that orange Arctic, about 10 to 12 feet from his rear end. Now, do you honestly think that when he'd put his brakes on, you could have stopped and avoided a collision?
Well, he pulled out in front of me. I didn't have a lot of options.
Yeah, but you were following him some considerable distance.
If you was watching, the other lad nipped in as he come across.
I then saw you travelling at that distance behind him.
I was behind him because it was his fault.
Yeah, but it wasn't very safe to be travelling at that. You could have quite easily eased off. You didn't brake till I was nearly alongside you when you saw me in your offside mirror. Don't you agree that if he'd have put his brakes on, you wouldn't have touched yours before you'd have hit him? That speed?
No.
You don't agree?
No.
Can I have a look at your records while we're here, please? Anyway, I say, word of advice. Keep your distances. If somebody does pull out in front of you...
I would never have travelled that close to him on purpose. It's just that he come across. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I'm not a novice at it. And there's no way I'd have, you know, travelled that close all the time. It's just that as he come across me, if I'd have looked up, the geezer behind me coming out could have hit me.
That's what we're talking about, though, keeping your distances on this road, OK?
Oh, yeah.
Fair enough, then.
Drivers, as seen by drivers. It sounds like an awful lot of people using an awful lot of petrol.
It's quite wrong to see road transport as a major consumer of Britain's energy requirements. It's quite clear that only 12% of Britain's total energy is consumed by road transport. Now, there are many things that can be said as an argument against the criticism that oil is going to perhaps run out, and the simplest is that as it becomes more expensive, then more oil becomes available. In the long run, there are well-proven systems for producing synthetic diesel, so-called syncrude, that is, diesel made from coal, and Britain's got enough coal to ensure 200 years of that. So as a general point, it's quite clear that the more vehicles use motorways, the less energy they use.
Of course, some people think we should have no motorways at all and see us inundated in concrete. Nick Lester of the conservationist pressure group Transport 2000.
I think there are two problems with motorways. First of all,
we haven't looked at the full consequences of them. And secondly, we're not comparing them with other forms of transport well enough. The consequences of motorway building are quite widespread. We say that they help our industry. We say that they help people to move around faster and more easily. The question of how much it helps our industry is really very unproved. There are two major points, particularly brought out in the latest government white paper, one of which says we build roads to remote areas to help their economic regeneration. Now, this just isn't going to happen. In the north, for example, over the last 10 years, there's been an increase in the road network of about 40%, and this compares with national average of about 7%. Yet at the same time, the economic performance of the northern region has gone down from third to worst in Great Britain to worst. What's much more likely to happen when you build a road to a remote area or to an economically depressed area is that it helps the industry from the prosperous central regions much more to, if you like, export to the remote areas than it helps the industry in those remote areas. Roads are very bad, they're a weak and they're a non-specific help to industry. There are very much better things we can do, very much better ways we can spend our money on helping industry.
Well, that's one view. But proximity to a motorway is the one thing that most helps some firms.
Well, we're mainly in the wholesale distribution as well as the retail distribution of automotive parts and accessories. And we have 250 branch outlets in the UK. We'll be setting up a central warehouse in due course to service all these branch outlets. And we will be placing this central warehouse in the South Midlands area, close to the motorway network formed by the M5, the M6 and the M1.
Another major problem we have connected with the industrial effects of roads is that they lead to centralisation. And we've seen this centralisation take place in industry, for example, the brewing industry or the baking industry. I think the alternative is that we don't have to move so much so far. If you're buying biscuits in the shops, you don't care less, really, whether your biscuits come from Aberdeen or Aldershot. Goods are moving much further. If we don't have motorways, the result will be that goods won't move so far. There won't be fewer of them. There won't be less variety. It just means that things will be that much more localised.
Disturbance, protest. It's one of the unfortunate results of new motorway building in an urban area when the carriageway comes too close for comfort, either visually or orally. Remember Westway?
We'll be on your back, Minister. We'll be on your back. First time.
It's a lovely road,
I can hear it.
How about the people? 1,000,000 miles of motorway has just begun. I hope another 1,000,000 miles is yet to come. Burn the buildings and the houses in the way. Turn the meadows into brand new highways.
It's a very major problem, and certainly the existence of so many motorways has generated the traffic which has led to these vast numbers of people living in noisy surroundings. Okay, so lots of people live next to roads in towns, but they have a choice really when they go there. They know that the road's there. For the vast majority of people, the motorway comes along after they've moved into that area, and it can be very difficult to move away.
1,000,000 miles of motorway has just begun. I hope another 1,000,000 miles is yet to come. Burn the buildings and the houses in the way. Turn the meadows into brand new highways.
But you don't have to be in a built-up area to be disturbed by noise.
I, as a kid, used to sit on the back doorstep and let the world go quietly by of an evening. My mother did that before me. Those days have now completely passed. The peace of the countryside has been destroyed.
An Essex farmer whose land has been bisected by our latest motorway, the M11.
We've lost about 30 acres of land out of an 800-acre arable farming unit, which is irreplaceable, especially immediately next door to the farm.
Presumably an amount of compensation was paid.
No amount of compensation is adequate for the land that was taken.
And of course, many farms have been affected.
Something like 0.5% of the total land area in Britain is covered with motorways. That's about the size of Greater Manchester and Merseyside put together.
The first stretch of motorway that I ever opened was a piece of the M25. It was pouring with rain, but in spite of that, about 200 people turned up. 15 of those, it is true, were opposing very vociferously a later stretch of the M25. Nothing to do, in fact, with the opening, but they were making their presence felt about it. The other 180 people had turned up and were standing literally in very thick mud to cheer the fact that this part of the motorway was being opened. And the reason for that was that this motorway was going to liberate their village from heavy traffic. I think we can be too glib and too generalised about oppositions to roads and to motorways. Often a motorway has not only an economic importance but an environmental importance, and often that environmental importance is actually seen very vividly by many of the people whom you may think would be opposed to it.
Most people don't mind if a new motorway goes through someone else's garden. And they don't mind if property values plunge right next to the motorway, as long as values in the area as a whole go up, including theirs, of course. Others resist on ecological grounds, though motorway banking often becomes a regular little nature reserve in its own right, never to be sprayed or ploughed or even trodden again by human foot, unless it be some forestry chap tending the saplings. For others, the battle becomes intense and personal. Amateur artist Leslie Lovelock recently fought and lost a 4-year battle against a 6-mile stretch of the M25 in Essex because it will destroy her favourite wood. It's estimated that Miss Lovelock cost the nation £100,000 a week. Horrifying? Well, Transport Minister Norman Fowler believes this is democracy at work.
Whenever you build roads, you are going to have controversy. There is a balance to be held as far as the national good is concerned and a balance as far as individual interests are concerned. I hope that the type of system that we now have, road inquiries, and the kind of attention that is given to objections does at least satisfy most people that we treat this very seriously and we don't seek to rush into decisions, nor do we seek to bulldoze schemes through against the will of the public. But I certainly defend the right of the individual to put his views when he thinks that his rights are at stake. I think that that is basic to this country's idea of justice.
So disagreement is as basic as ever, even on the very need for motorways. But what's the viable alternative to a motorway system in an industrialised society? The Road Haulage Association has told us about movement of goods. The very location of business premises is often affected. And of course, motorways affect the commercial representative. The motorway system gives the businessman enormous extra flexibility.
I used to get up at 5 in order to leave the house at 6. Bound for, in one particular case, Leeds, in another case, Liverpool, which was only 4 hours. And in the reverse direction, I was able to conduct meetings in Aberystwyth and leave there at 12, make further calls in the southwest of Wales, and get back for a dinner party near Cambridge.
Long distances to be covered quickly. That's how most of us see the purpose of motorways. In fact, the horizons of the average motorist have been dramatically widened by motorways. In one thrash, he can drive with his family from Glasgow to Exeter, from Hull to Manchester, from West London to Cardiff, without leaving the motorway. Well, he can, but should he?
There is a hard core of evidence that fatigue is a serious problem on certain motorways.
Medical Research Council psychiatrist Ivan Brown.
The main problem about motorways is that they tend to go through a featureless environment. You take a motorway and contrast it with driving through an urban area, and the motorway presents very little for you to look at. There's very little going on. And fatigue usually arises because alertness falls to a fairly low level. And alertness depends on two things, really: the interesting nature of the job we're doing and the interesting nature of the environment in which we're doing it. Now, clearly on a motorway, you're not doing a very interesting job. You're just steering your car along a lane, and the environment itself doesn't really ask you to do very much. Under these conditions, it's really not surprising that within about an hour, people tend to get very under-aroused. They begin to do things that they would not do at higher levels of alertness, such as drifting out of their lane, overlooking the fact that the vehicle in front was slowing down.
they begin to overlook these small insidious changes that they would have been detecting at higher levels of alertness.
We came up behind a lorry which was veering onto the hard shoulder into the centre lane twice, and actually veered onto the hard shoulder no less than 12 times, we actually counted. Presumably he felt sleepy and off he went.
Well, I was driving. I've never been on motorway before. I didn't know what to do actually. I took my foot off the accelerator. I took the car to the left-hand side of the road, which was a slower lane, and she slid across from one side of the road to the other and back again, and we ended up facing the oncoming traffic.
And it's not only the driver who may not be in an ideal shape to tackle the motorway.
My car, which was a modern Rover 2.5, 2.6, broke down on the M5 at about 12:15 on Saturday the 10th of April.
And then followed a 6-hour saga for one man and his family.
I was immediately by an emergency call phone. I phoned for help and was promised help from the AA as I was a relay member within the next hour and a half. The hour and a half went by, and shortly after that period, a pickup lorry arrived.
But it wasn't an AA lorry, it was a local garage vehicle, and its trailer was too small to take the Rover. Calls were made. The garage manager arrived with a hydraulic jack, but his car wouldn't restart. It was a long time before the stricken car got to the local garage.
At that point, I had been waiting 3 3/4 hours.
And still they were waiting for the AA relay vehicle. Well, 1.5 hours later, it came. But it didn't take car and family home. It took them to the Membry service area. There, of course, another wait.
We eventually got on board and arrived home at 10 o'clock that night, having waited 5.5 to 5 3/4 hours.
The AA's answer is that at times its services are stretched to the absolute limit.
Circumstances differ in so many parts of the country. For instance, in the West Country, in the height of the holiday season, the place is absolutely packed with motorists. They have something like 250,000 extra visitors into that part of the country alone. Now, when trouble occurs, obviously, the pressures upon the AA services in that part are very much greater than they are, say, in a quiet part of the country, the middle of Norfolk. Time then begins to come into it. On average throughout the country, as far as the breakdown service is concerned, we reckon to get to a member in trouble in an average of about 45 minutes. Relay takes a little bit longer, but when you consider that, say on a bank holiday Monday, we are relaying something like 300 to 400 cases out of the West Country alone, that is an awful lot of business, and an awful lot of pressure, therefore, is upon us. Everybody who breaks down thinks that they're the only one in the whole of Great Britain who has broken down at that moment. But we are answering at peak periods of the year something like 50 calls a minute somewhere in Britain.
Can I just ask you what the trouble is? You've broken down.
Yeah, the fan belt's gone.
What have you done, in fact?
I've got the police to contact the RAC. They'll come along with the fan belt. Luckily, half an hour, I shall be on my way.
Have you broken down much on motorways before?
Well, it's something that happens from time to time, you know. I do a hell of a lot of mileage on motorways.
What exactly happened?
Well, we've had bother with the radiator, and the fan belt here has got so bad that we've come to the danger level on the recorder here, and I've rang up, and the man here has taken the record of what's happened. So in a minute or two, if they phone him back, he said he'll contact the RAC for us, and he'll let us know whether they're coming out.
So who was it you spoke to, in fact, on the phone?
Well, I don't know, it'll be something to do with the Minister of Transport.
Yeah, have you had breakdowns with the RAC before? What sort of time does it take usually for them to come?
Well, I don't know. This is the first time we've had a breakdown. We've been in the RAC for 3 years now, and this is the first time we've had to use their service. So we're really waiting to see what their service is now.
So far as the motorway is concerned, the motorist's first call for help comes into a police control room. For the M1, that's Northamptonshire headquarters.
You've had a blowout. Right, I don't suppose you've got a spare tyre, have you? Do you know
Northamptonshire Police, phoning up for Mr. Roberts. He's broken down on the motorway.
But do Northants police suggest a garage to a stranded motorist?
We never suggest garages. We have a rotating list of garage proprietors who we call out, and it is in strict rotation. We never, ever suggest a garage to a member of the public. Some people may get a Mini broken down, some people may get a Rolls. It's just the luck of the draw.
Reasons for breakdowns vary, of course. Some are positively bizarre.
Bizarre? Well, all sorts of funny things do happen, but twice this year alone in the Midlands, we've been called out to troublesome cars and found, in fact, believe it or not,
that the reason was that there was a cat underneath the bonnet sitting on the engine, and those cats had travelled goodness knows how many miles before the motorist had felt that there was something not quite right with his car.
Do you mean the engine wasn't purring as it should be?
I'll give you that one.
Sorry about that. But actually, the police never know what they're going to find on the motorway. One Christmas, Leicestershire police found a man dressed as Santa Claus cycling along the M6 with a sack of presents over his shoulder. And Derbyshire police found a man exercising his greyhound on the M1 and a student camping on the central reservation with his washing hanging on a clothesline rigged from the crash barrier. Families picnicking on the hard shoulder and children playing tumbling games down the banking are fairly familiar. Occasionally, a Moslem motorist may be found on the hard shoulder with his prayer mat. He's pulled in at the prescribed hour, unrolled his mat eastwards, and is performing his traditional obsequies in the direction of Mecca. One of the faithful who explained this to an irate policeman was informed that he was facing the wrong way. The Mecca service area lay north.
I've been on motorway from Leeds, I've been on motorway about 2.5 years. And it was Dad, I see a set of headlights coming towards me. And I thought, what's this? It's my imagination, and there's a car going up fast lane, wrong way. And as it happens, it was a Pakistani who was driving it. So I goes into the police station at Watford Gap. I says, there's a Pakistani just went up motorway there. Oh, he says, they're quite common in this country now. I says, yeah, but he's away up the wrong way. You've never seen two policemen moving quick in all your days. They were into that car and away up the motorway behind them, like.
One important change in motorway rescue patterns is expected soon. Because the Department of Transport is to sell £1 million licences to private firms to operate on the 41 motorway service areas on a new basis, the motorway organisations will be able at last to help motorists stranded there. Up to now, we've had the absurd situation whereby motorists in trouble can only be rescued from the hard shoulder. It's meant unnecessary danger. Last year, the RAC lost a couple of patrolmen who were assisting at the side of the M4. And it's meant unnecessary cost. It's recorded that a gallon of petrol, plus call-out charge, plus mileage, can cost the improvident motorist almost £40. Motorway service areas are themselves, of course, a byword. People complain about petrol prices.
I was absolutely horrified to notice that the price of petrol is way fastening out £1.50 a gallon.
People complain about the decor and cleanliness.
Some of them are not very clean, are they?
People complain about the food.
Motorway food is a pretty bad. It's plastic junk and I've been had. They say it's a food, but it looks so sad. This motorway food's gonna drive me mad.
I think it could be a lot better. The food is generally quite poor.
I find some of it stale. I think it's poor quality for the money.
I've never ever been satisfied with a motorway meal.
Yeah. This man doesn't even love his own mother as owns this place. I went in there once and I looked at the trays. The fish looked as though they give themselves up. And I said, well, what else have you got besides? Have you got any pies? No.
I've never ever tried pies.
I said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll have sausage, egg and chips.
Sausages are dry and the egg's always overcooked.
So they said, oh, you can have sausage and chips, but you can't have sausage, egg and chips. So I said, why? Oh, we don't cook eggs. So I said, why don't you cook eggs? Not till 10 o'clock. So how do you get a decent meal at a place like that when they won't cook you one?
Motorway food is a pretty bad. It's a plastic junk. I've been had. They say it's food, but it looks so sad. There's a motorway food's gonna drive me mad.
In fact, according to the Consumers Association, although motorway service areas are far from appealing, they're not all bad, and improvements over the past 10 years have been considerable. Some motorists agree.
For what you pay, I don't think they're bad. I don't think they're haute cuisine exactly, but considering the turnover they've got, not as bad as their painted. I know you got Rome, but perhaps I'm not really satisfied. But I have had some quite good meals.
One of the problems for operators has been a low return, 2.5% on capital. Another has been manpower and access. Most service areas are isolated by road from local communities, and staff have to be brought in, some from considerable distances. You don't get the best people in this way, especially for night work. All this may change very much for the better once the service areas are run on the new basis.
What we are doing is to sell our interest in the motorway service areas. It is necessary, in my view, that the operators should actually sell themselves as operators of those motorway service areas, and there's no way that they're going to do that unless they can actually advertise their presence. And the second thing that we want is to devise some star rating so that you know that it is a 2-star or 3-star or perhaps a 1-star motorway service area that you're approaching. So to give more information to the motorist and to encourage more competition between them.
Well, we seem to have found little agreement. Motorways are essential, motorways are destroying us. We don't want them, but since we need them, they should run past someone else's door. We like their convenience, but we mustn't overstretch ourselves. We're in conflict with other types of traffic whose size, speed, awareness, consideration and experience differ from our own, and the balance constantly changes. So, how much more motorway?
We probably will get to a situation by the mid-1980s that we have finished most of the major motorway building.
What remains to be done between now and the mid-80s?
Well, there are some fairly major projects. The most important of all, I think, is the M25 around London. That is our #1 priority. In addition to that, there are other very important routes, like the Southern Orbital route round Birmingham, there is the Ring Road round Manchester, and there are other major motorway routes, like the link from Birmingham to Southampton. But we are reaching the stage when we are coming towards the end of the major motorway building in this country.
And so, back to Ernest Marples and that morning in November 1959.
We must create a road system worthy of the third quarter of the 20th century, and there's no earthly reason why we should fail.
Given the conflicting arguments we've had to consider, the money we've had to spend, and the British insistence on compromise, have we really failed?